Thank you, everybody, and welcome to the second part of our presentation for today. As John mentioned, we have a truly, we always have distinguished panelists, but really, truly distinguished panelists this morning for you. I'm just going to give a brief introduction because if I just read their CVs, we'd be done. But you have the details in front of you. So let me quickly introduce the panelists. We have, to my immediate left, Harold Furchtgott-Roth, who's director of the Center for Economics of the Internet at the Hudson Institute. And he has a very distinguished CV, which includes having served as the commissioner at the FCC from 1997 to 2001. And please correct me if this is wrong, but you are the only economist to have ever held that position. Is that still correct?
Yeah, I don't think they'll make that mistake.
Sitting next to Harold is our second economist, our second distinguished economist, Tim Brennan, who is a professor of public policy and economics at the University of Maryland Baltimore County. And among his many achievements and positions, Tim was chief economist at the FCC, as well as having held positions before in the Department of Justice and at the White House. And then last but not least, my recently former Berkeley, California neighbor, Jonathan Spalter, who has abandoned the beauty of California for Washington, D.C., to become CEO and president of USTelecom. Likewise, an illustrious past as well as an illustrious present, including previously as chair of Mobile Future and numerous government positions, including in the office of Vice President Gore. Hopefully you all remember Vice President Gore. We're not that young. What's that?
Founder of the Internet.
Well,
let's be clear. The staff founded the Internet. But being dutiful staff, we deferred credit to the boss.
We'll stay away from myths as much as we can. So, look, John sort of stole my thunder a little bit in his first question to Commissioner Riley. Was going to be my first question as well. I'll still ask it. But I thought the best thing to do to start, by way of introduction for each of you, is to ask you to tell us where you were in 1996 and sort of either what you were doing with regard to the 96 Act or how you felt about it if you weren't directly involved. And I asked this, and as John said at the beginning, we think, sort of why we structured the conversation the way we did today is we think in having a meaningful discussion, it's important to understand how we got here. And I was reminded of really one of my favorite recent New Yorker cartoons where the sort of old sage is sitting next to the young student, and the caption is, he says, the sage is saying, those who do not study history are condemned to repeat it. Those who do study history are doomed to stand by helplessly while everyone else repeats it. Which Amy and I were talking earlier, this is really, this is how you feel. That's Sisyphus is not far from this room. So actually let me, and this will be my only substantive contribution. I'll tell you first what I was doing in 1996. I had literally nothing to do, or very little to do with the telecommunications industry, but I was working on a strategy project for a very large German conglomerate in Dusseldorf. And one of their tiny little subsidiaries had a partial interest in a German telecom startup. And I was meeting with the CEO of this German telecom startup, and he was saying, he said, we are amazed by this new piece of legislation that was passed in America. You've completely deregulated your telecommunications industry in one piece of legislation. He said, we are trying to compete with Deutsche Telekom. We're only allowed to do very few things, but even we would not want such a complete piece of deregulation to happen all at once. And I said to him, well, knowing literally nothing about the industry at that point, I said, well, this is how we do things in America. When we realize something isn't working, we just throw it out and we start over. And that's the end. And of course, little did I realize that the passing of legislation is actually the beginning of the legislative process, most of which then happens in the courts. And that's certainly been the case for the 96 Act. It's been to court many, many times, including many trips to the Supreme Court. So I feel I should go back to Germany and apologize for my conviction that we were actually done when in fact we hadn't actually started. So with that, let me ask the people who really have something to say about 1996, and I'll start with you, Harold. We'll just move down the line on this one.
Sure. Thank you very much, Larry. Thank you very much to Georgetown for hosting this event today. It's a great pleasure to be here. I listened with great interest, John, as you were interviewing Commissioner O'Reilly. He referred anonymously to his boss. His boss was my boss as well, Tom Bliley of Virginia. Commissioner O'Reilly and I were two of the principal staff members for Mr. Bliley, along with Mike Regan and Kathy Reed, working on the what legislation became the 96 Act. It was as Commissioner O'Reilly described. There were lots of meetings, some public, some private, some with different groups of people. One thing that I would amend his statement on would be the internet, and I think actually all the members were very much aware of the internet. There was a little company at the time called AOL. It was actually quite a big company, if you look at the House legislation and the Senate legislation, they're quite different. The House legislation, we went to great lengths not to use the word internet because that would have meant a referral to the Science Committee and Mr. Walker and Mr. Bliley. Mr. Walker didn't get along so well, so we're not going to go to the Science Committee. The Senate didn't have these problems. And so if you look at provisions, and I can tell you exactly which members introduced these provisions, Section 254, which was the farm team in the Senate, that refers to the internet. Section 706, that was Senator Burns, that mentions the internet. Internet and Decency Act, that was Senator Exxon and later another part of the Senate. That was the Senate. There are many references to the Senate. They all originate in there are many references to the internet. They all originate in the Senate. They got included in conference, but it didn't go back to the Science Committee after it came out of conference. And so at least that's my version of the history of the internet and the 96 Act. With that, we pass it on.
Thanks, Harold, and thanks, Larry and Georgetown, for doing this. I guess I was going to say that my prematurely gray hair and receding hairline were just getting out of high school back then, but unfortunately that's not accurate. Well, the part about the hair and the hairline is, unfortunately. I wasn't really involved with this at all. I had done a lot of telecom work at the antitrust division for quite some time. Worked a little bit on thinking about the divestiture, but more in the context of competitive advocacy filings that the department had supplied to the FCC. My recollection of the act, since after it came out, was very much actually like Commissioner O'Reilly's, although I was probably coming at it from a somewhat different side. I was someone who, actually I felt very lonely about this at the time, thought that the divestiture in US v. AT&T was a good idea. And so I kind of read the act with an eye toward, how much of the MFJ is left, what are the criteria for letting the then monopoly local companies into the then nascently competitive long-distance market, what were those criteria like? And, everyone talks about 706 and classification. Back then, 250, 251, 270, these various things identifying these sorts of criteria. Now, those are the things that at least I, and I think a lot of the discussion that I was party to, we're paying attention to. As far as the classification issue, and I'm sure that's going to come up in a bit, to the extent that got some focus, I mean, there's some things about that were peculiar, which I would again probably come back to. But I think a first way of looking at it was if one's approaching this with the idea that, gee, I hope this doesn't do much damage to the MFJ, the modified final judgment in the antitrust case that broke up the phone company, basically. Perhaps having this distinction between telecommunications and information services made some sense in that context, and therefore it was, at least as I was thinking about it, a second-order issue and certainly not the crucial issue it's come to be today.
My perspective was actually an unusual one because I was watching the unfolding and the iteration, the heavy lifting, the pushing the log up the Telecom Act of '96 hill that had preceded '96 for several years from the perspective of 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, where I was on the staff of Vice President Gore at the time, actually focusing not only on the architecture substantively and politically around the act, but also in a more broader global context. I was actually more on the national security side of our thinking at the earlier stages about the global information infrastructure that was being elaborated. And while simultaneously we were working on the act, and really lucky that there was a political principle in the executive branch that was willing to serially put significant political capital on the table, Vice President Gore, in working on a bipartisan basis with leaders in Congress and at the FCC to get the act across the finish line. There was also a significant amount of work that was being done in thinking through what kinds of initial thinking do we need to envision in terms of harmonization of trade rules, of technology codes, what kind of international engagement can actually be created, what kind of multilateral organizations can purposefully be utilized to think about the internet and technology policy more globally. It was a really interesting time. I will say that a lot of the work that goes on in the White House is not just substantive, but it's a lot of theater. So you remember well the signing of the act, which Harold, in a really wonderful essay that he wrote called 4 Questions, called Memorable in its Pompousness, was held at the Library of Congress, tellingly because of the repository it has always been as Thomas Jefferson's library and the information resources that it had. Very careful thinking about, well, who will be some of the speakers at the event. I know that Congressman Bliley and Congressman Dingell and Senator Pressler, Speaker Gingrich all spoke at the event. Interestingly, it was Vice President Gore's father's pen that he used to sign, that was used to sign the 1957 Highway Act, Interstate Highway Act, that was used as the signing pen by President Clinton. Kind of a motif of reminding that this new approach that we're taking to connecting people through the power and promise of telecommunications is rooted in a deeper American theme of elaborating our infrastructure as a primary purpose of government. And it was also really interesting, the very first, as you noted, Harold, bill signing ever to be done simultaneously online. It was actually done through both the signing mechanism formally, but also through an online mechanism. And by the way, I mean, just to sort of think about context, where were we in 1996 in terms of technology? Well, I probably was logging on to my Compaq at my rental apartment somewhere in Georgetown for $9.95 a month for the first 5 hours. It was $2.95 an hour afterwards for my AOL subscription. Google and Amazon had just come online. I would wait about 20 seconds for my AOL account to load. How many people are actually not born in 1996 in the room? Anybody here? Okay, so this is great history. You would, once your computer was loaded, then you would sort of try to boot onto your Internet Explorer. Internet Explorer 3 had just been released, and it was a time when Windows 95 was still pretty cool. And then you would be able to, search the great array of interactive content, of which there was absolutely none. I think that the titles at the time were, there was Slate, there was Salon, a couple of other ones that no longer exist. Hotwired, Suck, or Urban Desires, Feed were some of the only places that you can actually go online, except gloriously the New York Times had just launched its own website. But it was 30 seconds to load each page. Meanwhile, there were 172 million subscribers to incumbent local exchange carrier networks, but only 20 million US adults at the time had online access in 1996. SMS, exactly 0.4 SMS text on average were sent by users at the time. It was a very, very early moment. To think how far we've come since then in the 21 years is rather remarkable.
Great. Well, thank you. Well, so I'm going to come back to a lot of these points. Certainly, I want to get into sort of what worked and what didn't work. But First, I want to pick up on something actually that Tim said, and this probably is more of a question for Harold and Jonathan. I think there's consensus that the initial classification, at least for internet services, was under Title I. Whether or not it can be reclassified or not is a different question, but that the intended classification of information services was to include internet. And it strikes me, and I may be wrong about this, but that was breaking with a long tradition, certainly within the history of communications technology. I commend to everyone in this room Tom Hazlitt's new book, The Political Spectrum. Again, those who don't study history and so on, it's just chock full of hilarious stories, unless you're one of the victims, and then it's not so funny. But I think it's the case that this was the first time that Congress took a new technology, which that seemed to have great potential already. I think that was pretty clear. And rather than subjecting it to heavy regulation, it subjected it to what, again, I think everyone agrees, at least at that time, was what we call the light touch regulation. So let me ask first Harold and Jonathan, and Tim, you can weigh in on this if you want to as well. Was that unusual? And how did we have the foresight, if that's what it was, to treat this particular emerging technology lightly where previous emerging technologies didn't get that treatment?
Well, as always, Larry, you've asked some very good questions. Let me try to touch them, not necessarily in the sequence you asked them. The Commission actually has a very long history of addressing new technologies that are not in statute, beginning back in the 1930s with radio networks and the case that ultimately gets decided in NBC v. FCC. 1970s, 80s, early 90s, the FCC is addressing new technologies all the time and trying to figure out some way to put them in. And the Commission had a long history actually of addressing what were the nascent internet technologies and the computer 2 and subsequent decisions the Commission made, where again there really wasn't a clear way of fitting these into the existing statute. Information services appears rarely in the Communications Act. It appears more rarely than the word internet. The Commission in the early 2000s came up with this construct of Title I information services. I think because the internet didn't clearly fall under Title II. Whether it's Title I or whether it's really even just completely outside of the Act, I think is up to some discussion. But I think this was an effort by the Commission to, as you described it, a light touch. It was definitely a light touch. Keep in mind, from the mid-1990s up until 2010, every politician of every stripe in America had one mantra. Had two mantras. Don't regulate the internet. Don't tax the internet. It was beyond imagination in the mid-1990s up until the past few years for any politician to advocate that the internet was somehow to be regulated, much less that it was to be regulated by a specific agency of the federal government and that specific agency would have this specific catalog of regulations.
Jonathan?
I think that there's also a meaningful prism to look at your question through, which is more of a political context. Let's not forget that 1994 was a signal year in American congressional politics where you had a significant shift in balance of power that gave rise not only to a vibrant and energetic and very focused a policy agenda led by Speaker Gingrich that found home ground in broad deregulatory frameworks, but also technology-driven interests, coupled with a White House that was looking at the '96 re-election campaign and evolved its own theory of triangulation of how you can actually accentuate specific centrist, deregulatory approaches in policy in new and fresh ways. So there was a meeting of the minds and a meeting of political consensus around the idea that you actually can meaningfully continue what had been the FCC's light touch approach when it came to advanced and computer services using our communications network, which I think was the political impetus that actually gave rise to the existence of and the language for Section 230, which famously said, "It is the policy of the United States to preserve the vibrant and competitive free market that presently exists for the internet," which there was very little internet at the time, "and other interactive computer services unfettered by federal or state regulation." So though it was a part of that narrative continuity of the FCC approach, I think there was this interesting political cocktail that existed, starting in '94, that set the stage for the Section 230 idea. That said, let's not forget that the Act also had provisions from the VCHIP, E-rate, and other add-ons that were not part of that narrative continuum.
Well, certainly, yes, the Communications Decency Act, the
Right.
part that was thrown out almost immediately by the Supreme Court that said, couldn't have indecent material.
Abortion provisions that were in the Act.
All right, so let me come back to Tim now, and so we're sort of carrying on this story. So that was the decision. It was light touch, and as Harold says, maybe it wasn't even light touch, maybe it was no touch. And obviously, over the last 20 years, the technology has evolved in ways that no one could have possibly predicted, and if they did, then they're lying after the fact. So we've had to respond, obviously, to things that have come up. Sometimes they seemed important and they turned out to be transient. Sometimes they seemed to be transient and they turned out to be important. Tim, how do you sort of assess the response of various agencies, including the FCC and the FTC and the Department of Justice and the Antitrust Division, in the wake of what the '96 Act did or didn't say about the internet? How have we filled various vacuums, and did we do a good job or a bad job?
Wow, I'm not sure how much of that I can really answer. I'll just throw out a few things, I guess. One, just in terms of the background, again, is that again, the politics and whatever of all this, but for decades, information services was that part of the internet that was, or that part rather, of the telecommunications sector that was supposed to be competitive, but for the nefarious actions, allegedly, of the telephone companies. So the idea that the '96 Act would treat information services in somehow this inherently competitive sector with a lighter no-touch regulation would hardly be surprising. As far as what's happened since, some of that, I guess, a lot of that is sort of legal. I mean, one sense of this is whether one got, in some sense, dragged into heavy touch regulation because of the way the Telecommunications Act was written. That if something, that whether or not something should be regulated is being thought about as based on what kind of service it is rather than whether it meets economic criteria for being regulated or not. Which means if you have a competitive telecommunications sector, it doesn't fit. And so it may be that if one decides that it's telecommunications rather than information service, one good question is, what do you mean by the internet here? Not just what do you mean by net neutrality, but net neutrality, is the internet, me tweeting something, or is the internet Comcast? I mean, there's a lot of stuff out there, and they're not necessarily all the same. They're obviously not all the same. Just one side thing about what the FTC and the Antitrust Division. I was rather appalled by the 2004 Supreme Court decision in Trinco. Not because I think the essential facilities doctrine ought to be revived necessarily as a general antitrust matter, but that despite the presence of an antitrust savings clause in the Telecommunications Act, Supreme Court basically said if the FCC has some authority over this, the antitrust laws ought not apply. And that basically takes the antitrust Division and the FTC, to me, out of the ballgame as far as dealing with some of the competitive problems that people have at least suggested. I'm not going to get to the merits of the suggestions, but at least have suggested in recent times. Recall that Howard Chalansky, when he was at the FTC, testified before Congress saying that, well, TRINCO is only limited to private antitrust suits. It doesn't apply to public antitrust suits. And the only basis for Howard's statement, I think, is wishful thinking.
Yeah, Jonathan, and then Harold.
To part of your question, which is if what might the world look like if in '96 the Act had taken a more aggressive approach. It's very hard to do a revisionist view of history, but I'll try. If information services were lumped in with telecommunication services as part of the Act, I do think that the trajectory of the development of the internet ecosystem broadly, and the US innovation ecosystem specifically, would have been significantly harmed. We know that the barriers and costs of entry for telecommunications service providers are very high, from tariffing obligations to the detailed cost and demand studies that are required, to the approvals and certification one needs from both federal and state regulators. If those had been equally applied with parity across what was then the emerging subsectors of the telecommunications ecosystem, including cable and including wireless, I wondered how many new entrants would have been encouraged, and whether the kind of pace and slope of investment and contribution to gross domestic output that has resulted would have been affected. You know, moving to the present, you know, are there corollaries? Anna Maria Kovac just came out with a really, I think, useful reminder about the impact that regulatory measures can have on CapEx investment when it comes to our sector. She noted that in 2016 there was a precipitous decline in CapEx in our wireless network, a theme and a trend that we reiterate in our own studies at USTelecom, more broadly across telecom. The theory that this is not just associated with the imposition of Title II, but causally related to it. I think there's increasing data points that suggest that there is that causal relationship. So past is not always prologue, but I think that if the Act had taken a more aggressive and assertive approach and had not taken that light touch approach, we would have all suffered the consequences, and literally would not be here talking about this wonderful internet and its still promise and opportunity that are ahead.
So, Harold, slightly different version of this question. So, you know, what would you say would have been the kind of the pros and cons of that regulatory framework in the '96 Act? What's worked? What hasn't worked in 20-year hindsight?
For the whole Act?
Well, for particularly the distinction between information services and telecommunication services. And
sure. First of all, I think as Jonathan accurately notes, the Act was a delicate balance. There was a lot of give and take on specific language. There was extraordinary, delicate work on definition of telecommunication services and the entire modifications of Title II. These were not accidents. Mm-hmm. These were not just the coincidental outcomes of staffers working late at night to come up with these things. There was a lot of care on telecom services. Information services, very little, because guess what? Information services are not really in the Act.
Right.
You won't find something that says, the commission shall do the following with information services. It's just not there. It's just not there. It is a permissive element of Section 254 on recovery of funds. It says the commission shall, with respect to telecom services, and may, with respect to information services, recover funds for the Universal Service Fund. I'm grasping to think of where else the commission specifically, where the Act specifically speaks of information services. There probably are a couple of instances it's very minor. The definitions in conference were heavily coordinated by Earl Comstock on Senator Stevens' staff. There was no intention to get the commission involved with the detailed regulation of the nascent internet industry or to apply Title II to information services.
Did you want to?
Yeah. I guess, to me, one symbol of what hasn't worked very well is the painful experience of reading the recent NPRM on the Open Internet Order, or revising or repealing or whatever, the Open Internet Order, whatever the terminology would be. Jonathan's heard me say this before. I basically, the arguments that are in there to try to define the service that Comcast, whatever, provides as an information service, I found just excruciatingly painful to read. It doesn't mean I disagree with the end that they're going for, but they're essentially, I read them as sort of extremely difficult to formulate responses to the person who's argued that it was a telecommunications service under the Act, who was none other than Justice Scalia in Brand X. And this is sort of what got me thinking about this classification problem, which is that if the only way we can have sensible policy toward what broadband providers can do is to figure out some way to call them information services, that's unfortunate. And my concern, and I'll leave this to the legal experts here on the table, is that this is why I said before, is that the telecommunications, the 96 Act, unfortunately, apparently forces people into that box. It would be a shame if perhaps, good reform, we can talk about what our ideas on that might be, maybe at some point, or at some later panel, as to what ought to be done, can't be done because, you just can't make this look like an information service. Scalia was right, when that really has nothing to do with anything, or should have nothing to do with anything as a policy matter. As a legal matter, unfortunately, it does.
Yeah. Well, let's move to that in sort of in a slightly backward way. Let's talk about today and what we need to be doing today. So we have, you've mentioned some of the court decisions that have changed the course of this river, the Trinco decision, the Brand X decision, and others. Obviously, there have been developments in the technology itself, particularly mobile, which was not considered a source of as a data service, certainly in 1996. So very succinctly, what do we need to do? Are you of the camp that thinks we need wholesale rewrite of the whole Act? Do you think we need some tinkering? Do you think it's an architectural problem? What would be your recommendation as a general matter of how do we move forward from here? Let me start this actually with Harold, and then Jonathan, and then Ted.
Well, thank you, Larry. I would. I start with the law is as it is, and you got to work with the law as it is today. I think that's particularly true with communications law. I don't see a scenario where you're going to have wholesale rewriting of the Communications Act anytime soon. And so I think you have to work with the laws it is today. I think the laws it is today can easily accommodate a lot of sensible policy. And I think that and hope that the Commission under Chairman Pai is going to get to better policy under the existing law. I think Congress, in its will always make the judgments that it does. It's just very difficult for me. My crystal ball is not even as clear as Commissioner O'Reilly's, but I just don't see in my crystal ball that the Communications Act is going to get revised anytime soon.
Sorry, but I'm not going to let you off the hook quite yet. So
Sure.
if there was some tinkering, not wholesale reform, or do you think we can work within the existing framework without any of that?
Oh, what if I were to?
If you were to tinker, is there anything you would tinker with?
Is there anything I would not tinker with? Again, that is such. It's something that would be great to do, but I spend my time thinking about how do you work with the current law. So I just I'm not engaged in trying to get Congress to do something that I just don't see them doing it anytime soon.
Well, that's futile efforts are
Sorry.
Understandable. Jonathan, are you more? I'm not sure if the word is optimistic, but are you? Do you think reform is more likely, and if so, what do you think it would be, and what do you think it should be?
Reform will be hard in the current environment that we're working through, but there are opportunities for progress, and there are reasons for optimism. First of all, in the immediate term, I really do believe that the roads still need to go up Pennsylvania Avenue and to Congress. We need to put to rest the argument about how internet access services should be defined, Title I or Title II. It is both helpful and important that the NPRM process moves forward, but ultimately we are going to enter into version 5.0 of that discussion. These have been, at the regulatory level, effectively software patches. And until we actually can get into the operating system of the code that needs to be really thoughtfully rewritten by the coders who inhabit the zip code that is in Congress, we're really not going to see the sustainable progress that we need. In the short term, I do believe that a wise Congress, a motivated Congress, can align around all of the goals we share about unencumbering broadband access providers from these confusing distinctions that have not been helpful to achieve our broader goals of getting broadband to all Americans. There are other things that can be done to complement that initiative. We can move forward to, again, unencumber broadband access providers through something like the Mobile Now Act with the various not only regulatory but operational barriers to lowering their cost structure to do the important work that's needed, from rights of way to pole attachment issues. There is also the promise and the hope that the President Trump's initiative to reinvest in American infrastructure up to the tune of $1 trillion might find, as we move into the political seasons closer to 18, a firmer foundation for progress. If so, we need to maintain our narrative around the primacy of broadband, a broadband first agenda that will apportion the right amount of assets through thoughtfully designed programs at the FCC, like USF and CAF, that will be able to continue to have a line of sight for confident investing and confident resources so that particularly our rural providers can solve that last mile challenge for the many millions of Americans who live in rural communities that still are not having access to the kind of broadband services that many of us have had. This is a day of action. And many folks on their internet sites will see the whirling symbol of doom. But it's also a day of action where men and women in every state, in every county of this country are climbing poles to connect communities to internet, are digging trenches, are pulling fiber. That kind of day of action needs additional congressional incentive for the long term. So we see that as 365 days of action every day where we see more broadband deployment and less immediate concern about the bottom line interests of only certain parts of the internet ecosystem.
Thank you. So, Tim, that's a little bit more optimistic, I think, although I don't want to paint Harold as pessimistic, but let me just put it to you. What have we learned in the last 20 years, and how does it inform your thinking about the next 20 years?
What have we learned, or what have I learned? I mean, I can only speak a little bit about the latter, such as that might be. I've actually learned a lot about this recently, in terms of thinking about this from being on panels like this and reading things that have been coming out and stuff like that. In terms of sort of translating learning into some sort of direction, I guess I'd like to see three things which I would like to think would just be tinkering, but I don't really know, especially in this day and age where, you know, passing a law saying the sky is blue would probably be impossible. One would be, as I've already alluded to, saying that is clarifying that the FCC, or anybody, but say the FCC, wants to impose price regulation or something like it, that it make the relevant economic findings to do so and not worry about whether it's a telecommunications service provider or an information service provider, but for the possibility that it may not have jurisdiction over information service providers. That's a boundary issue. It's not an issue about as a criteria for whether you're going to regulate, whether something should be regulated or not. The second thing would be for Congress to say, we meant it when we put an antitrust savings clause in the '96 Act, thank you very much, and somehow get, legislatively reverse Trinco. And the reason I think that's important is because the more I've thought about this and listened to people, the less I think that this whole overarching net neutrality concern is or should be an issue about economics. One of the unfortunate things at the FCC in recent years has been that the only way something is bad is if it looks like an antitrust violation. And if, in fact, there are antitrust harms that can come about from something like this, let the FTC and the Justice Department handle those as such. To do that, Congress might have to get repealed, say Trinco is no longer the law of the land. And then the FCC's basis for this shouldn't be a '96 Act thing, but you go back to, these are licensees in the public interest. For their history, by and large, they have provided ways in which, ordinary people can communicate through this medium. And we want to basically codify their past conduct. If something looks like it might interfere with that, then we'll have a look. But that'll be what the standard should be. Now, that would be what might be my NPRM. I have no idea what the record would say about the validity of that. We don't know because we don't have an NPRM about that. The current one's not about that. The 2014 one wasn't about that. And that's what I would like to see. The FCC may not have the space to do that. I'm not sure they have an inclination to do that at the moment, but they may not have the space to do that because of these other problems with the Act that could be fixed. I think it's tinkering, but it might not be.
Great. Well, thank you. Well, we have just a couple minutes, so if there's an audience question, a nice succinct audience question, that would be great. I have a hand over here all the way. Yes, you're exactly the wrong spot. So just real quick, if you could. Thank you.
Thank you. I want to take back people in time just a little bit, because the answer to most of your questions have already been resolved. In 1979, the FCC launched something called the competitive carrier rulemaking. In that rulemaking, the commission decided that it could forbear from regulating anything that it was suggested to do under the Communications Act if it felt the competitive market was solving the problem on a predictive basis. In the 1996 Act, that authority was explicitly endorsed. Therefore, I would suggest that Dr. Brennan, in fact, is simply describing the way the structure of the law already is once you classify something as common carriage. Once you do something as common carriage, as a matter of jurisdiction, nothing else has to be done if, in fact, you have an economic case to do it. My friend John Mayo spent lots of times, including in the 1990s, deregulating the old AT&T long distance business. They don't file tariffs, they don't file 214s, but they are technically still common carriage. So that this entire debate saying Title I versus common carriage has nothing to do with the statutory structure. Thank you.
Okay. Any response? That's pretty provocative, but, and it's beyond my pay grade to know that. I don't go back far enough to the 70s to know.
First of all, thank you for the comment, as always, wonderful insights. A couple of points of clarification. Section 10 of the Act, which is the specific section you're referring to, I think it's been an abject failure. It just has, there have been a handful of Section 10 proceedings to have the Commission forbear from various regulations. They take forever. They are very burdensome, and they've actually, I think many parts of industry have just given up even thinking about Section 10. Section 11, which is adjacent to it, is a requirement of the Commission to review not one, not two, not the ones they like, to review every single rule affecting common carriers every 2 years. The Commission has absolutely refused to do that for the past 21 years. I think Chairman Pai wants to actually follow the law on this. But I think these Section 10, Section 11 are part of the deregulatory structure of the 96 Act, which frankly for the past 21 years the Commission has largely chosen not to do.
Anybody else want to weigh in? Okay, great. Well, we're not going to keep you late, so I want to thank you. I really want to thank my panelists and for your attention this morning, but please help me thank our panelists.